4:12 a.m. St. Joseph, Michigan. January 23, 2026. The ice on the Benton Harbor Channel had thickened to 4 inches overnight. Temperature, 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chill, -8. The kind of cold that freezes diesel lines and kills batteries without warning. 12 vehicles moved in convoy along a private service road that ran parallel to the Lake Michigan shoreline. No headlights. Navigation only. Behind them, a shuttered Coast Guard auxiliary station sat dark on the bluff, the staging point they had occupied for 6 hours, running final checks in near silence. The lead vehicle stopped 200 yards short of the marina gate. Special Agent in Charge Donna Hartwell, Homeland Security Investigations, Chicago Field Office, stepped out of the second vehicle. She held a thermal imaging unit in her right hand. She raised it toward the boathouse at the end of the long dock. The screen showed 3 faint heat signatures. Consistent. Stable. Inside a structure listed in Berrien County records as winterized since October 2025. She lowered the unit. Said 2 words into her radio. Breach authorized. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say yet, was how many people were inside that boathouse, or whether they were still alive. That answer was 34 minutes away. Harbor Point Yacht and Sail Club sits on a private cove approximately 3 miles southwest of St. Joseph, Michigan. The club's main facility, a 62-slip members-only marina, a cedar-clad clubhouse with a teak bar, a fuel dock, and a covered boathouse large enough to shelter 4 vessels out of the winter weather. The membership list ran to roughly 140 families, old Lake Michigan money primarily. Sailboat racing in summer. Closed from October through April. The county's seasonal registration showed the facility as dormant. No active utilities billed after October 17, 2025. The caretaker, a man named Gerald Mosley, a fixture at the club for 11 years, logged his gate access twice weekly to check perimeter lights and pump bilge water from the dock lines. Routine. Documented. Unexceptional. The boathouse held 3 decommissioned 58-foot cabin cruisers. All 3 had been purchased in an estate liquidation in August 2025 by a company registered in Niagara Falls, Ontario, under the name Lakeshore Maritime Preservation, LLC. The county's harbor master records showed the vessels in dry dock, properly chained, for the off-season. Nothing about any of this was supposed to attract attention. The cell had been careful, meticulous even. The kind of operational discipline that takes planning and time and money, and someone who has done this before, in other places under other names. But on day 127 of a 129-day investigation, a marine welder in Benton Harbor made a phone call that ended everything. His name was Dale Vickers. He had run a one-man marine fabrication shop on Territorial Road for 19 years. He welded hull repairs, custom stanchion work, through-hull fittings, seasonal work, mostly, with a quiet winter that stretched from November through March. On January 20th, 2026, a purchase order landed in his email. The order came through a secondary subcontracting company, not directly from Harbor Point. The billing address matched a Marine Services LLC, registered in Indiana. The order specified 46 linear feet of stainless steel hull weld and a full argon carbon dioxide mixed gas cylinder, marine specification, to the Harbor Point address on the Cove Road. Dale Vickers had worked Lake Michigan marinas for nearly 2 decades. He knew every facility's rhythm the way a farmer knows growing seasons. No club on the eastern shore was pulling hull weld in January. Not ever. Hull work ran April through September. A winterized facility ordering welding gas and structural weld stock was not normal. It was wrong. He sat with the order for 6 hours. Then he called the HSI tip line. The call was logged at 11:41 p.m., on January 20th, 2026, 127 days after the first of the missing had been reported. The HSI duty agent who took the call flagged it to the Chicago field office within the hour. By 6 a.m. on January 21st, the case file had been cross-referenced with an existing multi-state missing persons cluster that the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had flagged to the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit in August 2025. The cluster, 14 missing across 4 Midwest states between June and December 2025. Ages ranging from 6 to 13. Different cities, different circumstances, no apparent connection. Until now. Here's what strikes you about this case when you read the documentation. The 14 were not taken together. They were taken across 7 months, in increments, in 4 separate states: Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Wisconsin. Each disappearance initially appeared unrelated, different reporting agencies, different circumstances, different geographic clusters. The National Center flagged the pattern because of 3 shared details in the case metadata: victim age range, timing of disappearances relative to known transit corridors, and a repeating detail in 2 reports that mentioned a white cargo van with Indiana plates and a partial magnetic sign. The FBI's Crimes Against Children unit had been working that cluster since September 2025. They had a working hypothesis. They had surveillance threads on 3 known Balkan-linked logistics operations active in the Great Lakes region since 2023. What they did not have, until Dale Vickers called the tip line, was a location. The hull weld order was the thread. One purchase order for 46 feet of marine weld stock, delivered to a structure with no legitimate reason to be active, pulled the entire case into focus. This wasn't supposed to work. The cell had layered the order through a subcontractor. They had used an Indiana LLC with a clean 2-year paper trail. The billing name didn't match the marina address directly. By every metric, it was well obscured. What they didn't account for was Dale Vickers, a man who had worked these marinas long enough to know that the math was wrong. Not wrong in a way a financial audit would catch. Wrong in a way that only someone who understood marine seasonal patterns would ever notice. One person, one detail, one phone call. The FBI's reaction was immediate and precisely calibrated. Within 24 hours of the tip call, the Chicago Joint Task Force assembled a surveillance package. 2 agents in a rented fishing cabin on the south end of the Cove Road, legitimate rental, existing reservation used as cover, established visual and thermal observation on the boathouse. A second surveillance team staged on the county road. The thermal analysis confirmed it within 8 hours. The 3 vessels in the boathouse were running thermal signatures inconsistent with dormant hulls. Specifically, the center vessel, hull number 2 of the 3, showed a diffuse but consistent heat pattern in the lower hull section, below the waterline, in the area that corresponded to the keel cavity. On a properly winterized cabin cruiser in a closed boathouse in Michigan in January, that signature should not exist. An emergency warrant package was drafted and submitted to the Western District Federal Magistrate on January 21st at 11 p.m. The warrant cited the thermal anomaly, the hull weld purchase order, the cross-reference to the missing persons cluster, and surveillance observation of 2 vehicles, a black Dodge Ram pickup and an older Ford Transit, entering the boathouse via a secondary access gate on the evening of January 21st. Gerald Mosley's caretaker access logs showed no scheduled visit for that date. The warrant was signed at 2:17 a.m. on January 22nd. The operational planning had begun before the warrant cleared. FBI hostage rescue team elements were already in transit from Quantico. The request had gone up the chain on the afternoon of January 21st, within hours of the thermal confirmation. HRT's readiness posture allows deployment staging within 6 hours of activation. By 9 p.m. on January 21st, 12 HRT operators were wheels down at a private airfield outside Kalamazoo. The staging point, the shuttered Coast Guard auxiliary station on the bluff above St. Joseph, had been selected in the planning phase because it offered visual concealment, vehicle access to the Cove Road, and a direct line of communication with the waterborne element. Michigan State Police provided a perimeter containment unit, 8 troopers with 2 vehicles staged at the county road junction, tasked with controlling access and preventing egress. The operational timeline called for the breach at 4:12 a.m. on January 23rd. The decision used that specific window for 3 reasons. The thermal imaging showed the highest heat concentration between midnight and 5 a.m., suggesting maximum occupancy of the hull cavity during those hours. The guard rotation placed both individuals in the boathouse itself during that window, and the ice on the cove made any waterborne escape route non-viable. One detail has stayed with me in reviewing this case: the cutting torch decision. The standard HRT breach toolkit runs through explosive charges, hydraulic spreaders, and ram entry for most structural penetrations. Harbor Point presented a different problem. The hull cavities had been retrofitted with false floor panels welded from inside, the same stainless steel stock from Dale Vickers' purchase order. The panels were not doors. They were structural welds. You could not breach them with a ram. You could not use explosives without risking harm to whoever was on the other side. The decision was to use cutting torches. The same tool that had sealed the hull cavity would open it. The breach team trained on that specific technique for 6 hours at the staging location on January 22nd, using a salvage hull section that a Michigan State Police Marine unit sourced from a Muskegon scrapyard in 18 hours. The operators rehearsed the cut sequence until it was muscle memory. At 4:12 a.m. on January 23, 2026, the convoy moved. What no one on the breach team could know going in was the exact condition of whoever was behind that weld line. 129 days is a long time. The boathouse entry took 4 minutes. The 2 individuals inside, later identified as nationals of a Balkan country, names sealed in the federal charging document at this stage, were taken into custody without significant resistance. One attempted to access a door at the rear. A Michigan State Police trooper was already on the other side of it. The center hull was pulled to the center of the dry dock cradle after the guards were secured. The cutting team went to work at 4:21 a.m. The false floor panel ran approximately 18 feet in length, welded along a continuous bead at both lateral edges. The cavity beneath had been retrofitted with a ventilation duct system, a flexible corrugated line running from a concealed exterior intake on the hull's starboard side, with a small inline electric fan. That fan had been running continuously. It was what created the heat signature that the thermal imaging had detected. The ventilation system told investigators 2 things. The cell had engineered this space with the intent to maintain it for a significant duration, and they had taken specific steps to defeat thermal detection. The insulation on the hull cavity walls was consistent with commercial HVAC-grade material, applied in a double layer. The fact that the signature was visible at all resulted from cumulative heat over time, not a failure of their insulation. 1 or 2 more weeks, and the signature might have dissipated below detectable threshold. The cutting team completed the primary weld line at 4:38 a.m. 17 minutes. The panel was lifted by 2 operators. The space beneath measured roughly 18 feet by 8 feet. The ceiling height was approximately 4 feet, insufficient to stand. The ventilation duct ran along the port side. There was artificial lighting, a strip of 12-volt LED mounted to the overhead panel. The 14 were inside. All of them. The youngest was 6 years old. The oldest was 13. They had been missing for between 41 and 218 days. This is where the documentary record becomes deliberately sparse. The boathouse was sealed for 90 days of forensic work. Only 3 HRT operators and the lead HSI special agent entered the hull cavity before it was cut apart for evidence. The case file entry for the extraction sequence is 11 lines long. It documents the time of first contact, the number of individuals recovered, the presence of medical personnel, and the time the last individual was transferred to a waiting vehicle. What it does not describe is the moment itself. What it does record is this: at 4:46 a.m. on January 23, 2026, all 14 were out. The operation had run 34 minutes from the first vehicle reaching the boathouse gate. The convoy departed the facility at 5:02 a.m. 3 vehicles transported the recovered group to a pre-staged medical facility in St. Joseph, a private wing of Spectrum Health Lakeland, cleared and secured for the purpose. FBI Victim Services personnel were already on site. The 2 individuals apprehended at the boathouse were transported to the Western District Federal Holding Facility in Kalamazoo. Within 6 hours of the extraction, family notifications had begun. The calls went out through the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit coordinators, working off the missing persons cluster file. Each notification was delivered by a field agent in person, coordinated across 4 states. Parents who had not slept a full night in weeks, some of them in months, got those calls before sunrise. Most people assume a case like this resolves the moment the breach is over. It doesn't. The work that happens in the subsequent days is, in some ways, the harder part. The forensic processing of the boathouse took 41 days before the structure was cleared for demolition. The hull cavities of all 3 vessels were dismantled and cataloged as evidence. The ventilation system, the lighting, the insulation, the weld material, all of it was cross-referenced against purchase records, supply chains, and the known logistics operations that the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit had been tracking since September. What emerged from the forensic work was a picture of a cell operational in the Great Lakes region considerably longer than 7 months. The Lakeshore Maritime Preservation LLC traced back through 2 shell layers to a parent entity registered in Zagreb, Croatia, under a name that had previously appeared in a Europol Organized Crime Intelligence report from 2023. The same parent entity had a dissolved Michigan LLC that had listed a commercial address in Grand Rapids. That LLC had been active from 2022 through early 2024. Harbor Point was not the first. The cell had operated out of at least 1 previous facility in the Great Lakes region before relocating. The Grand Rapids address corresponded to a commercial warehouse property near the Gerald R. Ford International Airport. That property had changed hands in March 2024. By the time the Bureau connected the entity chain to that address, the trail was 2 years cold. Here's what this reveals about how these networks operate. The sophistication is not in the technology. It's in the patience. Harbor Point used no exotic materials, no advanced electronics, no unusual tradecraft. It used a property with legitimate seasonal cover, a plausible corporate ownership layer, and the reasonable assumption that nobody drives through a private marina in January. The actual advantage was the location. A hull cavity in a dry-docked vessel on a winterized facility is a dead zone by almost every surveillance metric. Thermal drones don't get tasked to close marinas in winter. Local law enforcement doesn't run checks on caretaker logs. The county's seasonal records are not a surveillance product. The cell had found a gap in the system and built their operation inside it. What they had not modeled was Dale Vickers, the marine welder who sat with a purchase order for 6 hours before deciding to call. A man with no law enforcement training, no institutional incentive, no formal reporting obligation. Just someone who knew his trade well enough to recognize that the math didn't add up. In the HSI tip line transcript, Vickers' opening statement is this: "I probably should have called sooner. I didn't want to be wrong." 6 hours of hesitation. 129 days from the first disappearance. The smallest possible margin. The federal charging documents filed in the Western District of Michigan on January 24, 2026, named 6 individuals. The 2 apprehended at the boathouse. 2 additional individuals arrested the same morning at addresses in Benton Harbor and Portage, coordinated with the boathouse breach, timed to run simultaneously. A 5th individual, identified as the operational coordinator for the Great Lakes logistics chain, was arrested at Chicago O'Hare International Airport at 6:15 a.m. on January 23rd as he attempted to board a flight to Vienna. The 6th named defendant was not arrested that morning or that week. The individual identified in court documents only as the cell's financial controller, the person responsible for the payment architecture behind the LLC layer and the subcontractor invoicing system, has not been located as of the filing of this record. The federal indictment lists this individual as a fugitive. An Interpol red notice was issued in February 2026. The financial architecture itself has been only partially unraveled. Prosecutors have traced approximately $2.3 million in payments through the shell company network. The total estimated operational revenue, based on known activity period and similar network structures, is believed to be considerably higher. The difference has not been accounted for. Here's what stands out about how close this was to being missed. The Crimes Against Children Unit had the missing persons cluster in September 2025. The Organized Crime Unit had the Europol intelligence link to the Croatian parent entity as early as late 2024. Those 2 pieces of information existed in the same agency. They were not connected until a civilian welder called a tip line in January 2026. The question that surfaces is why it took 127 days and 1 phone call from outside the system to assemble a picture that the Bureau had the components for months earlier. The 5 individuals in custody, as of February 2026, face federal charges under multiple statutes. The 2 apprehended at the boathouse face the most serious exposure. The Chicago O'Hare arrest, the operational coordinator, has been identified in court filings as a Croatian national with prior Europol flagging. His legal proceedings are ongoing in the Western District. The 6th defendant remains at large. That's a genuine question. The numbers support both answers. The investigative reconstruction of how the 4-state abduction series unfolded took considerably longer than the raid itself. Agents working the case file spent the weeks following January 23rd building the operational timeline backward, tracing the logistics routes, the acquisition sequence for the vessels, and the specific method by which the cell had accessed and concealed them without triggering any of the county's routine access protocols. What they found was a degree of operational planning that ran back at least 14 months before the first abduction. The vessels had been identified and evaluated as a potential concealment location in late 2024. The shell company acquisition of the property interest, not the marina itself, which remained under its original members' association ownership, but a sublease arrangement on the boathouse through a maritime storage LLC, had been structured in stages, beginning in January 2025. The retrofitting of the hull cavities had been completed in 2 phases. The first phase, in early October 2025, used a different fabrication contractor, someone outside the region who had no local knowledge of marina seasonal patterns and therefore no reason to flag the job. That first contractor was identified in the forensic paper trail and interviewed in February 2026. He had no knowledge of what the work was for. He had been told it was a live-aboard privacy modification, a common enough request in the marine custom market to pass without question. The second phase, the final weld work that sealed the cavity after the last had been placed, was the order that went to Dale Vickers. Put yourself in the position of the cell's logistics planner for a moment. You have a contractor who successfully completed the first phase without raising any flags. You have a working system. You have a timeline and a deadline, and then your primary subcontractor is unavailable. The case file does not specify why, and you need a replacement. You find one through a second-tier referral network, send the order through your standard LLC layer, and expect the same result. What you don't know is that the replacement contractor has spent 19 years learning to read the seasonal rhythms of every marina on the eastern Lake Michigan shore like a farmer reads soil. The vulnerability was not technical. It was human. The cell had optimized for institutional blind spots. They had not modeled for individual expertise. The operational planning did hit one significant obstacle before the breach. The thermal imaging team, on the afternoon of January 22nd, reported a sudden drop in the heat signature from the center hull, a reduction significant enough that, for approximately 4 hours, the signature fell below the threshold used to justify the warrant application. The breach was nearly postponed. The magistrate was notified. A 3-hour extension was requested while the surveillance team assessed whether the signature had moved or had simply dissipated. It was the lead HSI special agent, Donna Hartwell, who made the call to proceed. Her reasoning, documented in the post-operation report, the ventilation fan's electric current was still drawing from the same circuit, meaning the inhabited space had not been evacuated. The heat reduction was consistent with the victims being moved to a lower position in the cavity, reducing convective heat rise. The space was still occupied. The people were still there. She was right. The prosecution case, as of the spring 2026 filing date, rests on the physical forensic evidence recovered from the hull cavity and the boathouse, the financial document chain linking the defendants to the shell company network, the surveillance records from the 48 hours preceding the breach, and the testimony of the Benton Harbor tip-line caller. Dale Vickers was subpoenaed as a material witness in March 2026. He appeared before the grand jury. The transcript is sealed. The 3 cabin cruisers were dismantled and removed from the property in February 2026. Harbor Point remains closed, its membership association having voted in an emergency session to surrender the property to federal civil forfeiture proceedings. The 62 slips sit empty. The Junior Regatta trophy case is still on the wall of the boarded-up clubhouse. The caretaker, Gerald Mosley, is cooperating with investigators under a cooperation agreement. His involvement, the charging documents suggest, was limited to gate access. He did not know what the boathouse contained. Whether that is fully accurate remains a question the defense will contest. The discovery that the cell's parent entity had prior operational history in the Great Lakes region, the Grand Rapids warehouse address from 2022 to 2024, opened a separate investigative thread that is still active. The federal file on that prior location has not been publicly disclosed. Prosecutors have stated in court filings only that the investigation into prior operations by the same network is ongoing and active. What that means in practical terms, Harbor Point was not the beginning of this network's activity in the region. It was a chapter. The chapter before it is still being written. What this case reveals about the investigative system is worth sitting with. The technology deployed, thermal imaging, multi-agency coordination, HRT rapid deployment, real-time warrant processing, worked precisely as designed. The breach was clean. The extraction was complete. No one was injured. Every institutional mechanism performed. And yet the central fact of the case is that the institutional mechanisms did not find the location. A welder did. The lesson here is not that the technology failed. It's that technology optimizes for what you pointed at. Nobody pointed it at a winterized marina, because winterized marinas are not in the surveillance targeting model. The human who understood that specific domain, with that specific knowledge, looking at a specific anomaly in a specific document, that was the capability that closed the gap. The sixth defendant, the financial controller named in the federal indictment, remains the most significant unresolved element of this case. The Interpol Red Notice and cooperating agency notifications have been in place since February 2026. No arrest has been made. The payment architecture this individual constructed has not been fully dismantled. Prosecutors have traced $2.3 million. The operational structure, as described in court filings, suggests a considerably larger financial footprint, distributed across multiple jurisdictions. The assets tied to that larger footprint have not been located. There is one element of the network structure that the case file references but does not detail: a connection to a legitimate marine industry business operating under a different name in a different Great Lakes port city. That thread is referenced in the indictment but sealed from public view. If enough people want that piece of the story when it surfaces, there may be a follow-up worth doing. The 5 individuals in custody face trial in the Western District of Michigan. Dates have not been publicly set as of the time of this account. The most serious charges carry federal sentences that, under applicable guidelines, run to multiple decades. The financial controller named in the 6th count is in the wind. The missing persons cluster that the National Center flagged in August 2025, 14 cases, 4 states, 7 months, is now closed on the recovery side. The families are together. The specific nature of what those 129 days contained, for the families and for them, is not part of the public record. Victim services documentation is sealed. The federal case file describes only the facts material to prosecution, the structure of the network, the evidence chain, the charges. The rest belongs to the people involved. It is not in the case file. It should not be in this account. What is in the case file, the detail the account ends on, is this: the hull cavity in vessel number 2, once fully dismantled for forensic processing, measured 144 square feet. The false floor was sealed with a single continuous weld bead. The ventilation system ran off a 12-volt marine battery with a rated capacity of 72 hours. The last welding gas cylinder, delivered in the January 20th purchase order, was 3/4 full when the cutting team opened the hull. The cell had been planning to do more weld work. They had material left. They were not done. The indictment is filed. 5 of the 6 defendants are in custody. The financial architecture that funded this operation, across whatever prior locations, whatever prior timeline, whatever scope the sealed investigative file represents, has not been fully accounted for. The network that used Harbor Point is dismantled. The infrastructure knowledge that built it, and the money that paid for it, has not entirely been found. Dale Vickers' shop on Territorial Road opened for the spring season in April 2026. He did not speak to press. He has not given interviews. The HSI tip line that he called on January 20th, 2026, receives an average of 31 calls per day across its regional routing. Most of them don't go anywhere. This one did.